The year is 1970. The location is the freezing, crushing depths of the Barents Sea north of the Arctic Circle. This is the backyard of the Soviet Navy, a bastion where their nuclear-armed submarines are supposed to be untouchable, hidden beneath layers of thermal currents and ice. Captain First Rank Valery Petrov stands in the command center of a Victor-class nuclear attack submarine. The air inside the steel hull is thick, smelling of recycled oxygen, amine, and sweat. The only sound is the low, rhythmic thrum of the reactor cooling pumps and the distant cavitation of their own propeller blades churning through the water. To the uninitiated, it sounds like power. To Petrov, and every sonar operator in the Northern Fleet, it sounds like a beacon. They are running a combat patrol, hunting for intruders near the Kola Peninsula. But the mood in the control room is not one of a predator stalking prey. It is the tense, suffocating atmosphere of a man walking down a dark alley who feels eyes burning into the back of his neck. "Sonar, report," Petrov orders. His voice is low, clipped. "Contacts negative, Captain. Ocean noise normal. Biologics normal," the sonar officer replies, pressing the headphones tighter against his ears, his eyes darting across the waterfall display. "Nothing in the baffles, I think." That qualification, "I think," hangs in the air like toxic gas. The baffles. It is the cone of deafness directly behind the submarine, created by the noise of their own screws and the turbulence of the wake. It is a blind spot, a vulnerability. In the physics of underwater warfare, if an enemy is quiet enough and skilled enough, they can slip into that cone of silence and sit there, tracking the Soviet boat for days, weeks, perhaps even an entire patrol. They could be 500 meters behind Petrov's rudder right now, armed with torpedoes, and he would never know it until the metal hull buckled around him. Petrov looks at his executive officer. They share a look of grim understanding. They have felt this sensation for months. Reports from other captains in the Northern Fleet share the same paranoid consistency, the feeling of being shadowed, phantom transient noises that vanish before they can be identified, strange wakes appearing on the surface where no ship should be. It is time to clear the baffles. This is not a standard naval maneuver found in the textbooks of other nations. It is a violent, desperate, and mechanically abusive action born of fear. In the West, intelligence officers will later come to call it the Crazy Ivan. To the Soviet crews, it is simply a way to ensure they are not about to die. "Prepare for baffle clear," Petrov commands. "Hard right rudder. All ahead flank. Emergency power." The order is insanity. In a car, this would be drifting across 4 lanes of traffic at highway speeds without looking in the mirror. The helmsman spins the wheel. The reactor officer pulls control rods. The submarine, a steel tube displacing thousands of tons of water, screams in protest. The sudden acceleration and violent turn cause the hull to groan under the pressure. Maps slide off tables. Men grab railings to stay upright. The submarine banks sharply, drifting sideways through the water due to its own massive momentum, swinging its bow around a full 180 degrees in a matter of seconds. The objective is twofold. First, to physically throw the sonar sensors out of the own ship noise, allowing the microphones to listen to the water that was previously in the blind spot. Second, and more terrifyingly, it is a check for physical presence. If an American hunter is sitting in the blind spot, this maneuver is designed to force a collision or a panic reaction. It is a game of chicken played with nuclear reactors. "Listening!" the sonar officer screams over the groaning metal. Silence. The ocean is empty, just the fading swirl of their own wake. "Nothing, Captain." "Clear." Petrov exhales. The crew relaxes, but only slightly. They check the baffles, and they find nothing. But the fear does not dissipate. Because if there is nothing there, why did the hair on the back of Petrov's neck stand up? And if there was something there, something so advanced that it could evade even a violent check like that, then the Soviet Union is in far more danger than the Politburo understands. This scene was repeating itself across the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Mediterranean. Soviet captains, the elite of the Red Navy, were throwing their billion-dollar vessels into suicidal turns, risking hull breaches and reactor scrams, chasing ghosts they could not hear and could not see. If you want to understand the hidden mechanics of global power, the technology that defined the silence, and the history that others ignore, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We dig deeper than the headlines. The stakes of this mystery were absolute. To understand why a simple blind spot caused such panic, you have to understand the nuclear strategy of the 1960s and 70s. The Soviet Union relied on a strategy of second strike. If the United States launched a nuclear surprise attack, the Soviet land-based missiles might be destroyed in their silos. The guarantor of their survival, and the only thing keeping the Cold War from turning hot, was the ballistic missile submarine, SSBN. These boats were the underwater vaults of the apocalypse. They were designed to disappear into the vastness of the ocean, hide for months, and, if Mother Russia fell, surface to unleash a retaliatory nuclear strike that would erase the United States. But that strategy relies on one single non-negotiable premise. The submarines must be invisible. If the Americans could track the Soviet missile submarines, if they could trail them from the moment they left port, follow them into the open ocean, and hold them at gunpoint without being detected, then the Soviet nuclear deterrent was a myth. It meant that in the event of war, the Americans could sink the entire Soviet sea-based nuclear arsenal in the first 5 minutes of the conflict. By 1971, the reports reaching the Soviet high command in Moscow were painting a picture of a catastrophe. It wasn't just the crazy Ivan turns yielding no results, it was the inexplicable failures. A Soviet boat would be patrolling deep in the Atlantic, thinking it was perfectly hidden, only to have a US Navy destroyer surface directly above it and signal good morning via active sonar pings. It was the sensation that the Atlantic Ocean, a body of water covering 41 million square miles, had somehow become a glass bowl. The Soviet Admiralty was not dealing with a specific weapon system they could analyze. They were dealing with an ontological crisis. They had built the largest submarine fleet in human history. They had poured a significant percentage of their gross domestic product into titanium hulls, nuclear reactors, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. They believed they had achieved parity with the West. But out in the black water, their captains were acting like frightened animals. They were executing emergency turns. They were reporting ghosts. They were coming back to port exhausted, claiming that the ocean itself was listening to them. Was it a new radar? No, radar does not work underwater. Was it a network of spies in Murmansk telling the Americans when the boats left? Possible, but the tracking was too precise. Was it magic? The Soviet military apparatus, usually slow and bureaucratic, began to convulse. They needed to know what was hunting them. The safety of the communist world depended on solving a mystery that had no physical form, no sound, and no name. They were looking for a phantom that could swim right up to their exhaust ports, listen to their heartbeat, and vanish before they could turn around. This was the acoustic gap. But to the men in the water, it just felt like a noose tightening around their necks. The reports from the Barents Sea did not vanish into the ether. They traveled 3,000 kilometers south, arriving in the austere, high-ceilinged offices of the main Navy staff in Moscow. Here, the panic was not visceral like it was for Captain Petrov in the freezing water. It was bureaucratic, cold, and deeply dangerous. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the father of the modern Soviet Navy, was staring at a map that made no sense. To the Soviet Admiralty, the ocean was a mathematical equation. They knew the range of their own sonar. They knew the theoretical noise levels of their submarines. Based on their calculations, a Soviet Victor-class submarine should have been detectable by an American vessel, only at a range of perhaps 5 to 10 kilometers. This provided a safety buffer. It meant the ocean was big enough to hide in. But the patrol logs told a different story. Captains were reporting that American destroyers were initiating contact almost immediately after the Soviet submarines left their territorial waters. There were no search patterns. The Americans weren't looking for a needle in a haystack. They were walking directly to the needle, picking it up, and holding it. The investigation began with a purge of logic. The KGB was brought in. Their first conclusion was the most comfortable one for a paranoid state: treason. If the Americans knew exactly where the boats were, someone in Murmansk or Vladivostok must be telling them. The KGB tore through the naval bases. They interrogated dock workers, supply clerks, and the families of sailors. They looked for radio transmitters in officers' apartments. They looked for invisible ink in letters sent to the West. They found nothing. This terrified the High Command more than finding a spy would have. A spy is a problem you can shoot. A technological ghost is a problem that eats your budget and destroys your strategy. The investigation then moved to the scientific bureaus. The Rubin Design Bureau, responsible for the hulls of the Soviet underwater fleet, was ordered to explain the impossible. They began to analyze the crazy Ivan maneuvers. They looked at the hydroacoustic records. When a Soviet submarine turned 180 degrees to check its blind spot, the sensors should have picked up the distinctive thrum of an American propeller if one was close enough to track them. But time and again, the tapes were blank. This led to the phantom theory. Soviet scientists began to hypothesize that the Americans had developed a new class of standoff weapon or sensor drone. Maybe they weren't trailing the Soviet subs from 500 meters behind. Maybe they were tracking them from 50 kilometers away using some unknown physics. This theory drove the Soviet naval doctrine down a dead-end road that would cost them billions of rubles. Convinced that they could not win the game of silence, because they couldn't even hear the enemy that was hunting them, the Soviets decided to change the rules of the game entirely. They concluded that if they couldn't hide, they had to be faster, deeper, and more aggressive. This miscalculation birthed the Project 705 Lira, known to NATO as the Alpha-class submarine. The investigation into the American Ghost led the Soviets to build a titanium monster. The Alpha was a technological marvel and a strategic disaster. It was designed to dive deeper than any torpedo could follow and swim faster than any American ship. It was the Soviet answer to the mystery. We don't know how you are finding us, but we will build a ship so fast you can't catch it. By the early 1970s, these titanium giants were entering the water. They could hit 41 knots. They were automated, requiring a tiny crew. The Soviet Admiralty breathed a sigh of relief. They believed they had solved the problem. They believed they had out-engineered the Ghost. But the investigation had missed the point entirely. While the Alpha was fast, it was noisy. At 40 knots, it screamed through the water like a jet engine. The Soviets had built a race car for a competition that required a ninja. They were so obsessed with the hunt part of the equation, the speed, the chase, the evasion, that they ignored the detection part. Meanwhile, the strange encounters continued. In 1974, a collision occurred that should have been the smoking gun. A Soviet submarine collided with a submerged object in the waters off Scotland. The impact was metal on metal. The Soviet captain, terrified, surfaced and checked for damage. He saw paint scrapes. He saw dents that matched the curvature of another submarine's sail. He reported the contact. "I hit them," he signaled. "They were right on top of me." The investigation team in Moscow analyzed the damage. It was clearly a collision with a US Navy submarine. But here was the maddening part. The American boat had not surfaced. It had not radioed for help. It had simply vanished back into the deep. How? How could a vessel sustain a collision that dented a titanium or high-yield steel hull and just slip away silently? The Soviet engineers looked at their own noisy, clunky pumps and gears. If a Soviet sub had been hit, the racket of broken machinery would have been audible for miles. The American boat had remained silent even while damaged. This birthed a new, darker legend in the mess halls of the Northern Fleet. The Black Hole. The sailors began to whisper that the Americans weren't just quiet, they were acoustically invisible. They speculated that the Americans had found a way to negate sound waves, like a stealth aircraft negates radar. It wasn't just quiet machinery, it was witchcraft. The paranoia reached a fever pitch. Soviet intelligence, the GRU, began to scour open-source American journals for clues. They looked at budget reports from the US Congress. They saw massive line items for oceanographic research and anti-submarine warfare. But the details were redacted. They saw the launch of strange ships, the USNS Bowditch, the USNS Dutton. These were officially listed as hydrographic survey ships mapped to study whale migration and ocean currents. But when Soviet trawlers got close to them, they saw massive cable reels on the decks, miles and miles of cable. The Soviet analysts looked at the maps. They drew lines where their submarines were disappearing. They drew lines where these whale-watching ships had been spotted. A terrifying pattern emerged. The Americans weren't just chasing the subs with other subs, they were wiring the ocean itself. The investigation committee finally produced a classified report in the mid-1970s. It was an admission of systemic failure. The report stated that the acoustic gap was not a myth but a strategic chasm. It estimated that American passive sonar was 10 to 20 years ahead of Soviet technology. But even this report failed to grasp the true horror of the situation. They thought the Americans had better ears. They didn't realize the Americans had built a completely different kind of machine. The Soviets doubled down on their crazy Ivan tactics. If the technology couldn't save them, the captains would have to. The orders went out. Be unpredictable. Be aggressive. If you suspect a shadow, turn into it. Scare them off. This desperation created a vicious cycle. The more the Soviet captains executed violent maneuvers to clear their baffles, the more noise they made. The more noise they made, the easier they were to track. And the easier they were to track, the more the Americans tightened the noose, sitting comfortably in the blind spots, recording every screw turn, every pump cycle, every transient noise. The Soviet investigation had failed because it asked the wrong question. They asked, what secret weapon are they using to catch us? They should have asked, what are we doing that makes us so easy to find? They were looking for a magic bullet. They didn't realize the killer was simple physics, exploited by an adversary who had decided that silence was more lethal than speed. As the 1970s dragged on, the Soviet Navy possessed the largest submarine fleet the world had ever seen. Hundreds of boats, thousands of missiles. But inside the main Navy staff, the mood was grim. They knew the numbers were a lie. They were commanding a fleet of ghost ships vessels that were effectively dead the moment they left the pier, marked and trailed by an enemy they could not see, could not hear, and could not shake. The mystery remained unsolved. The crazy Ivans continued, spiraling through the black water, searching for a hunter that refused to be found. While the admirals in Moscow were chasing phantoms and blaming saboteurs, a very different scene was unfolding 4,000 miles away. The answer to the Soviet mystery wasn't found in a magic spell or a sci-fi weapon. It was sitting in a dry dock at the General Dynamics Electric Boat Facility in Groton, Connecticut. If you walked the floor of the American shipyards in the 1960s and 1970s, you wouldn't see the frantic, brute force production lines of the Soviet Union. You would see something closer to a watchmaker's workshop, scaled up to the size of a cathedral. The American solution to the underwater war was philosophical before it was mechanical. The Soviets believed in the high and fast doctrine submarines that were titanium-clad bullets. The United States Navy believed in a doctrine that was far more patient and infinitely more deadly. First look, first shot, first kill. To achieve this, they built the Sturgeon class and, later, the Los Angeles-class attack submarines. These vessels were the source of the Soviet nightmare, but to the naked eye, they looked like standard black cylinders. The secret was inside, hidden beneath the high-yield steel. It was a mundane engineering innovation that changed history. Sound isolation rafting. In a Soviet submarine, the turbines, the pumps and the cooling fans were often bolted directly to the frames of the hull. When a pump vibrated, the hull vibrated. When the hull vibrated, the ocean vibrated. The submarine effectively became a giant underwater speaker, broadcasting its location to anyone with a microphone. American engineers realized this was suicide. In the Sturgeon-class boats, they built a ship within a ship. The noisy machinery, the reduction gears, the turbo generators was mounted on floating rafts. These rafts were separated from the hull by rubberized mounts and sound-dampening tiles. It sounds simple. It was agonizingly difficult to engineer. It required manufacturing tolerances that the Soviet industrial base simply could not replicate. It meant that an American submarine could be moving at 15 knots and emitting less noise than the background chatter of the shrimp and whales around it. But silence was only half the equation, the other half was the ears. While the Soviets were still relying on analog systems and human operators trying to distinguish blips on a screen, the US Navy was digitizing the ocean. They introduced the BQQ-5 sonar suite and the concept of narrowband analysis. This was the game changer. American sonar didn't just listen for noise, it listened for specific frequencies. The computers could strip away the sound of the waves, the rain, and the biologics. They could isolate the 60 Hz hum of a Soviet refrigerator pump or the specific frequency of a Soviet reduction gear. This allowed American captains to develop a terrifying tactic, the trail. An American Sturgeon-class submarine, like the USS Lapon or the USS Tautog, could pick up a Soviet boomer, a ballistic missile submarine, as soon as it crossed the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. This was the Guke Gap, and the Americans had wired the floor of the ocean there with a secret network of hydrophones called SOSUS. SOSUS was the tripwire. It would tell the hunter-killers, "Target is moving south." The American attack sub would then slip into the water, dive deep, and intercept the Soviet boat. The goal wasn't to destroy it, not yet. The goal was to become its shadow. The American captain would maneuver his vessel into the baffles, that blind cone behind the Soviet screws. He would match the Soviet speed perfectly. If the Soviet sped up, the American sped up. If the Soviet dove, the American followed. They were so quiet, and their sensors were so sensitive, that they could hear the daily life inside the Soviet hull. American sonar operators later recounted stories of hearing the hatch of a missile tube being inspected, or even a wrench being dropped in the engine room. They knew the acoustic signature of individual Russian subs better than the Russian mechanics did. They gave them nicknames based on their specific rattles and squeaks. This was the reality of the Ghost. It wasn't a phantom, it was a 300-foot-long American warship, staffed by a crew of highly trained 20-year-olds, sitting less than 2,000 yards off the Soviets' rudder, unseen and unheard. But this proximity created the incredible tension that led to the Crazy Ivan. From the perspective of an American captain, a Crazy Ivan was the most terrifying moment of the Cold War. Imagine you are the captain of the USS Sturgeon. You have been trailing a Soviet Victor-class sub for 3 days. You are deep in the Atlantic. The tension in the control room is absolute. You are running silent, lights dimmed, the crew moving in socks to avoid making a sound. Suddenly, the sonar supervisor screams, "Target is clearing baffles! Hard right rudder!" The Soviet sub in front of you suddenly throws itself into a violent 180-degree turn. He is swinging that massive steel tail directly at your face. If you stay the course, you collide. If you speed up to evade, your propeller cavitates, creating a loud explosion of bubbles, and you reveal your position. You have failed the mission. So, the American captains had to do the impossible. They had to hit the brakes. All stop, rig for ultra quiet. The American sub would drift, motionless, suspended in the black water. The crew would hold their breath. The Soviet sub would thunder past them, its active sonar pinging wildly, its screws churning the water. The Soviet captain would look right at the spot where the American had been seconds ago. But because the American sub was rafting-mounted and stationary, it was a hole in the ocean. The Soviet sonar would sweep past the silent American hull. The Crazy Ivan would complete its circle. Finding nothing, the Soviet captain would assume he was alone, turn back to his original course, and resume his patrol. And then quietly, the American captain would order, "All ahead 1/3," and the Ghost would fall back into line. This was the height of American dominance. They were turning the Soviet Union's strategic nuclear deterrent into a liability. The Soviets thought they were hiding a needle in a haystack. The Americans had built a machine that could magnetize the needles. By the late 1970s, the US Navy was confident that in the event of World War III, they could sink 80 to 90% of the Soviet submarine fleet within the first 48 hours. The balance of terror had shifted. The Kremlin's ace in the hole was actually being held at gunpoint. But hubris is a dangerous thing. The Americans became so good at this game, so confident in their technological invisibility, that they began to believe it would last forever. They believed the Soviets were simply too incompetent or too technologically backward to ever close the gap. They were wrong. While the American crews laughed at the noisy farm machinery they were trailing, a man in California was walking into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a general. He was a warrant officer in the US Navy with a high-level security clearance and a mountain of debt. He was about to hand the Soviets the key to the lock, and when he did, the silence of the deep would be shattered, leading to a revelation that would shake the Pentagon to its foundations. The resolution to the mystery of the American Ghost did not come from a Soviet scientist solving a complex equation, nor did it come from a daring raid by Spetsnaz commandos. It arrived in a plastic shopping bag, carried by a balding, middle-aged American man with a bad toupee and a desperate need for cash. His name was John Anthony Walker. He was a chief warrant officer in the United States Navy, a communications specialist who had access to the most sensitive cryptographic data in the Western world. For nearly 18 years, he operated the most damaging spy ring in American naval history. But while Walker provided the Soviets with the daily key lists that allowed them to decode millions of secure US Navy messages, his most devastating contribution was not a code. It was a simple, terrifying conversation. The scene of the confrontation was not a battlefield, but a dimly lit safe house in Vienna, Austria, in the late 1970s. Walker was meeting with his KGB handlers. The Soviets were frustrated. Despite decoding the American messages, they still couldn't understand how the US Navy was physically locating their submarines in the open ocean with such pinpoint accuracy. They were still obsessed with the idea of a secret sensor or a magical device. Walker, with the arrogance of a man who knew he held all the cards, looked at the KGB officers and shattered their worldview. He told them, effectively, "There is no magic. "You are just too loud." He explained that the US Navy wasn't using a secret radiation tracker. They were using the cavitation of the Soviet propellers. He explained that the Americans could hear the specific frequency of the Soviet reduction gears. He detailed how the US Navy attack submarines would simply wait in the baffles, listening to the clanking machinery of the Soviet boats and laughing as the Soviet captains executed their crazy Ivan turns. "When you turn," Walker reportedly explained, "we don't panic, we just stop. We drift. You check your blind spot, hear nothing, and turn back, and then we start our engines again." The shock moment for the Soviet High Command was absolute. The report that went back to Moscow was devastating. It revealed that the Crazy Ivan, the maneuver that Soviet captains prided themselves on, the maneuver that they believed proved their aggression and skill, was actually a tactical joke to the Americans. The Americans weren't scared of the turn. They had turned it into a routine drill. The Soviets realized that their entire naval doctrine was built on a fallacy. They had spent billions of rubles building thousands of hulls, but they had neglected the precision machining required to make them silent. They were building tractors, the Americans were building Rolls-Royces. The realization triggered a panic in the Kremlin. The mystery was solved, but the solution was a death sentence for their strategic ambition. They knew they were naked in the water, but the Soviet Union, for all its flaws, possessed a terrifying capacity for industrial brute force. Once they understood the problem that their propellers were imperfectly shaped and created noisy bubbles, cavitation, at high speeds, they moved to fix it with desperate speed. This leads to the frantic and ultimately futile countermeasure, the Toshiba-Kongsberg affair. The Soviets knew they couldn't manufacture the high-precision propellers needed to silence their boats. Their domestic milling machines were simply not accurate enough. So, in a covert operation in the early 1980s, the KGB orchestrated the illegal purchase of advanced 9-axis computer-controlled milling machines from the Japanese company Toshiba, along with control software from the Norwegian company Kongsberg. These machines were banned from export to the Eastern Bloc. They were the crown jewels of Western manufacturing technology. Through a complex web of shell companies and falsified end-user certificates, the Soviets smuggled them into the USSR. They installed them in the Baltic shipyard in Leningrad, and they turned them on. The result was the Akula-class submarine, Project 971. When the first Akula slipped into the water in 1984, the shock finally hit the Americans. For decades, the US Navy had enjoyed a comfortable lead. They called it the happy time. They could track a Soviet sub from the moment it warmed up its reactor. But suddenly, in the mid-1980s, the screens at the SOSUS listening stations went blank. The new Soviet boats, with their computer-milled propellers and rafting systems copied from American designs, courtesy of Walker's intel, were silent. The ghost had crossed sides. Now, it was the American sonar operators who were sweating. They would be tracking a contact, and then it would just disappear. The acoustic gap had closed overnight. However, this technological triumph brings us to the tragedy of the Soviet response. It was a futile response not because the technology failed, but because the context had changed. The Soviets had finally built a submarine, the Akula, that was arguably the equal of the American Los Angeles class. They had solved the mystery. They didn't need to do crazy Ivans with the Akula because they could trust their own sonar to hear the Americans coming. But the victory was hollow. By the time the Akula entered service in numbers, it was 1986, 1987. The Soviet economy was in freefall. The cost of producing these high-tech, titanium-heavy, precision-milled submarines was astronomical. The Soviet system was designed for mass production of simple, rugged gear, like the T-72 tank. It was not designed for the artisanal creation of high-tech stealth assets. To build the Akula, they had to cannibalize other sectors of their economy. They poured billions into the shipyards while their grocery store shelves went empty. Furthermore, the Crazy Ivan legacy could not be erased so easily. While the new Akula class was quiet, the Soviet Navy still possessed hundreds of older Victor, Delta, and Yankee-class submarines. These boats were still loud. They were still vulnerable. And their captains, trained in the old paranoia, continued to execute the suicidal turns. The Americans, realizing the gap had closed, shifted their tactics again. They moved away from passive listening, waiting for noise, to active low-frequency sonar, broadcasting sound. They introduced the ADCAP, Advanced Capability, torpedo, designed to kill the new, quiet Soviet threats. The Soviets had spent 20 years and their national treasury chasing the American ghost, only to find that when they finally caught up, the Americans had simply changed the game again. The specific reveal moment that their loudness was their death warrant broke the spirit of the Soviet Naval Command. They realized that they had been playing a game of poker where their opponent could see their cards in the reflection of their own glasses. The Crazy Ivan wasn't a maneuver of strength. It was the twitch of a nervous player who knows he is about to lose everything. In the final years of the Cold War, the ocean remained a dangerous place. But the dynamic had shifted from a turkey shoot to a deadly high-stakes standoff. The Soviets had their quiet boats, but they had too few of them, and they arrived too late to save the empire that built them. The Crazy Ivan was more than just a maneuver. It was a symptom of a terminal illness that had infected the entire Soviet military-industrial complex. By the late 1980s, the verdict on the underwater Cold War was in, and it was delivered not in a declaration of war, but in the silent, crushing mathematics of attrition. The killer statistic that defined this era is not found in the number of ships sunk, but in the ratio of detection. Declassified naval analysis from the end of the Cold War suggests that during the height of the happy time before the Walker spy ring closed the gap, Western naval forces held a contact success rate against Soviet submarines that approached 100% in key choke points, like the Gyuk Gap. Think about what that number means. It means that for nearly 2 decades, the Soviet Union spent billions of rubles, sacrificed the health of thousands of sailors to radiation poisoning, and warped their entire national economy to build a nuclear deterrent that was, effectively, useless. If the order had ever come to launch World War III, the Soviet captains would have opened their launch orders, only to find a Mark 48 torpedo tearing through their pressure hull before they could flood a single missile tube. The Crazy Ivan turns were not saving them. They were merely delaying the inevitable by a matter of minutes. The impact of this realization on the Soviet Union cannot be overstated. It contributed directly to the economic asphyxiation of the state. The Soviet economy was a rigid, centrally planned machine. It was excellent at producing raw, steel, and concrete. It was terrible at producing the delicate, high-tech microelectronics and precision milling required for modern silence. When they realized they had to compete with American rafting and digital sonar, they tried to pivot. But you cannot pivot an elephant on a tightrope. To build the Akula-class submarines and the Sierra-class titanium boats, the Soviet Admiralty demanded a blank check. They needed new factories, new alloys, and new computers. The Kremlin signed the checks, but the bank account was empty. The cost of chasing the American ghost bled the Soviet treasury dry. While American grocery stores were full and the US economy was booming under the tech revolution of the 1980s, the Soviet citizen was standing in line for bread. Partially because the national wealth was being poured into the bottom of the Barents Sea to fix a propeller noise problem that John Walker had pointed out. This is the macro theme of the story. The Crazy Ivan was a microcosm of the Soviet Union itself. Just like their submarines, the Soviet state was powerful, heavy, and dangerous. But it was also blind to the true nature of the world around it. It was paranoid, constantly executing violent, lurching turns to find enemies internal and external, while failing to fix the structural noise in its own engine. The American strategy wasn't to fight the bear, it was to bankrupt the bear by forcing it to run a race it wasn't built for. The legacy of this underwater duel is still with us today. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the West inherited the nightmare. The Akula-class submarines, the ones that were finally quiet, didn't disappear. They were inherited by the Russian Federation. For the chaos of the 1990s, they sat rusting at their piers in Murmansk and Vladivostok, their crews unpaid, their reactors cooling, but the designs remained. The knowledge that silence is life had been burned into the Russian naval consciousness. Today, the modern Russian Navy has abandoned the sheer numbers of the Soviet era. They no longer build hundreds of noisy tractors. Instead, they build fewer, but far deadlier, vessels like the Yasen class. These boats utilize all the lessons learned from the failures of the Cold War. They are rafted. They use spherical bow sonar arrays. They do not need to make Crazy Ivan turns because they can hear us as well as we can hear them. The acoustic gap has closed. The ocean is no longer a glass bowl for the US Navy. It is once again a dark forest, filled with predators that know how to step softly. But we must remember the men who lived through the era of the suicidal turn. Imagine being a 19-year-old conscript on a Soviet Victor-class submarine in 1975. You are underwater for 80 days. The air is foul. The food is canned. You know, because the officers whisper about it, that there is likely an American hunter-killer right behind you. You can't see him, you can't hear him, but you feel him. Every 6 hours the captain screams, "Crazy Ivan, hard right." The world tilts. The plates smash in the galley. You grab a pipe to keep from breaking your ribs. You wait for the collision. You wait for the crunch of tearing metal that means you will drown in the freezing dark. And then, silence. The boat rights itself. The patrol continues. You do this again and again, chasing a ghost, never knowing that the ghost is just watching you, recording you, and waiting. This was the reality of the Cold War at sea. It wasn't a battle of missiles. It was a battle of nerves, fought in the blind spot of a periscope, where one side had the technology to listen, and the other side had only the desperation to turn. The Crazy Ivan remains the ultimate symbol of that era. A maneuver born of fear, executed in blindness, by a superpower that was powerful enough to destroy the world, but too loud to save itself.